Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Steven.
I'm Daniel. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and click that bell for notifications when a new episode drops, or subscribe to our channel.
That's right. We're moving through our first 500-year series, and previous to this, we talked about how at this time period you start to see the shift to a Sunday worship. And we had mentioned in there the early Roman bishop.
Just briefly.
We talked about Polycarp going to Rome. And I think before we move any further into the second century, we kind of have to address the elephant in the room. And that is, did Peter actually leave successors? Was there a single Roman bishop in the early second century? Because there is a lot of scholarly doubt about that, right, Dan?
Yeah, and in fact, the majority of scholars, Protestant or secular, would say that there doesn't seem to be a single bishop in the Roman Church in the early second century.
Yeah, if you read even Catholic scholars, if they're entrenched in academia, they'll even be kind of weak on it.
They'll go along with it.
Yeah. They'll. I don't. And you know how that goes. You don't know if they're playing along or what they're doing, but a lot of them will sort of toe the line of the current scholarly consensus that there really isn't a single strong figure leading the Church of Rome from the time of Peter to, at least they say the mid-second century, which some historians will go even further into the early third century with, which I think would be a little bit far-fetched. But I think before we get into it, I want to remind our audience that we're big believers in the working of providence in history. That's what we look for on this channel. So on this channel, we're not looking for this squeaky clean, neat story because history doesn't work that way.
We're not looking for 21st century Roman Catholicism in the first and second century.
Exactly. So we have to remember that we're telling the story of the church. The end of this story is the Catholic Church. That's the end of the story. But we're still in the beginning of it. So we shouldn't expect to see, say, a Vatican I papal infallibility understanding of the church's structure and constitution in the first century, because Vatican I is chapter 24 of the book of the church's story. We're in chapter 1.
Right.
So what we really should be looking for and paying attention to is the seeds of Vatican I. What in here in this early period is the raw
laid a
material.
Foundation.
Yeah.
We have to always remember as Catholics what St. Paul said, that the apostles' job was to lay a foundation. Mm-hmm. And St. Paul says that there will be others who come to lay other things on that foundation, whether it be hay or a brick. We don't know, but there's going to be a building that's going to be built over the centuries. Mm-hmm. And like anything else, we have to recognize as Catholics that things do develop over time. Even a Protestant has to admit that the doctrine of the Trinity had to develop over time, yet they still believe in the Trinity. So, why is it when we come to something like the papacy, is there so much, so much of a move to say, well, it didn't exist and it wasn't there? Not in the way it was there in the 1750s or in the 2020s, sure. Mm-hmm. But was it there in its foundation? That's what's important.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Trinity and Christology, because if you were to do, let's say, a whole seminar on the Christology or the Trinitarian theology of the New Testament, I mean that would be a wild ride too, because
which we did, and it was a wild ride.
It is a wild ride, yeah. Like what does it mean to say that he learned to turn from the evil and choose the good, and these kinds of things. Or what does it mean when he says that, he's let this cup pass from me, Father, but not as I will, as you will. Those are tough passages. Okay, so let's not pretend that this is all just cut and dry. Things develop over time. The church ponders, reflects, draws upon its apostolic inheritance to answer questions.
Well, that's important, what you just said there, drawing upon the tradition that has been handed down, drawing from that font, if you will.
Yeah. So in the outset to this episode, there's another thing that I want to kind of put in our listeners' heads, and it's two questions. So usually the question is there a single bishop of Rome in the early second century? early 2nd century being after Peter. Okay, but I think we would distinguish between almost two questions. You have the question, is there a single bishop of Rome? And then there's the question of, did Peter leave a personal successor? And I think those are two different questions.
Two separate questions.
We'll kind of explain why. They're related, but they're not the same question. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk about that. The other thing, to set the boundaries of the conversation, we want to sort of set this within bookends. So what do we know, right? We know that Peter was the leader of the apostles. There's no question about that. Whether you're an Protestant Protestant or an Orthodox, it doesn't matter. We all agree that Peter clearly is the rock. He's designated as the rock. He's the leader of the apostles. Jesus reinstates him and says, feed my lamb, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. So Peter is clearly the leader, and even in the book of Acts, we see him as the leader of this Jerusalem community. Okay, so between Peter, and then when do we really firmly kind of know that there's a single bishop of Rome? And we would say it's the episcopate of Anicetus, all right, in the mid-2nd century. So the question then is kind of what happens between Peter and Anicetus? What's going on? And admittedly, the sources are very tough. They're scant, but they're also very difficult even when they do say something that you can grab onto. Okay? Yeah. So there's plenty of material here for scholars to write theses.
Ambiguity is good for theses.
Yeah. Well, I think we should maybe just quickly mention why we're saying Anicetus, because there are scholars who will say that no, that's still way too early. Like David Brack, for instance, he wrote a book called The Development of the Monoepiscopacy in Rome, and he places the first real bishop of Rome, all the way into the early 3rd century, which I think most sensible heads would agree is really far-fetched.
Well, plus you have to be careful on how he's defining Bishop of Rome. And what are his definitions? What are his benchmarks for saying what is a Bishop of Rome? Yeah,
pay attention to his criteria.
Right, exactly.
Besides, you're never going to read it anyway because the book is like $700. So
that's an ivory tower book. It's an ivory tower book.
Yeah. So why would we say that? Well, in our previous episode, we did mention, right, that Polycarp traveled to Rome to meet with Anicetus.
Yeah, it's in the historical record. St. Irenaeus relates it as well, that Polycarp went to meet with Anicetus to decide an issue that was plaguing, a question that was plaguing the church at the time.
Well, and why is that? Yeah, and why is that important, right? Well, it says specifically Irenaeus, again, like late 2nd century, and successor to Polycarp, actually, or one of Polycarp's students. He says that Polycarp goes there to convince Anicetus of the Asiatic position on when to celebrate Easter. Now, why would an 70-something?
So Polycarp is very old. Would be very old at this time.
Actually, he's in his 80s. He's early 80s, probably late 70s, early 80s. Why would he travel across the empire to go to Rome to meet with some random presbyter if there's no single bishop of Rome and it's just this big collection of elders in the city? Why would he go there to meet with some random elder named Anicetus to try and convince him of his Asiatic position on Easter and then go back to his see and then accomplish nothing? Makes no sense. So he goes there to obviously convince the leader of the community.
The leading presbyter bishop, the leading one, who is Anicetus.
Yeah, exactly. And we also have... Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so the other thing is the only reason I'm saying Anicetus is because I'm not saying Pius, which is his immediate predecessor. Because we do even also have some scant, but we still have some source material that would even suggest that Pius is a single bishop of Rome, like pretty firmly.
Explicitly, right.
Yeah, one of those is the Muratorian Canon, right?
Yep. So the Muratorian Canon is that famous document stemming from Rome in the late 2nd century that is literally the first list of the New Testament canon that we have on record. Mm-hmm. And in that, there's other pieces of bits of history in this document. One of those pieces of history is saying that Pius ruled as Bishop of Rome.
Yeah. It actually says, quote, Hermes wrote the Shepherd quite recently in our time in the city of Rome, while his brother Pius,
Pius.
the bishop, listen to this, was sitting on the throne of the church of the city of Rome. Now, a lot of scholars will immediately say, oh, well, wait a minute, that's anachronistic. He's sitting on the throne in Rome, you know? But that's because, you know, they're not recalling, at least, that's not necessarily an anachronism, right? I mean, the idea of there being a teaching chair in Rome or in any church at this time is actually very likely, because the tradition of the time, especially amongst the Jews, was in the synagogues, for instance, there would be a seat, a chair of teaching, because even in the Gospels it says Jesus went up on a mountain, you know, and then he sat down and began to teach, because the posture of teaching was to sit down.
Yeah, or he says of the Pharisees that they seat themselves in the chair of Moses.
There you go.
He's literally speaking of the teaching chair in the synagogues, that they sit themselves in Moses' chair pretending to be an authority when they're getting him all wrong.
Right. And it's the Greek word either thronon or cathedra. So it's where we get the word cathedral. So, you know, thrones or teaching chairs were of common use amongst the Jews, not only in the temple, of course, the high priest, but like you said, in the synagogue. We also have a witness at this time in the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian and the apologetic literature, that this is the time during Pius, Anastasius' predecessor, that this is the time.
So like in the 140s.
144 to be exact, July of 144 is when Marcion, a heretic that we'll talk about eventually, is literally expelled from Rome by a council of the presbyters in Rome. Well, again, that at least suggests that we have a well-structured church with some kind of a leader to gather a council in Rome, you know, similar to like what we see in Polycarp's Smyrnian community, right?
Yeah, so there was, we know of the councils that took place in Smyrna, where the sources tell us that the presbyters expelled this heretic or that heretic. But we know for sure that Smyrna was one of those cities very early on that had a single bishop, namely Polycarp. So just because a source doesn't say that there's a single bishop involved in the decision or some historical event and just refers to elders or the presbyter bishops, whatever, doesn't mean there isn't a preeminent figure within that council of presbyters.
That's a great point. You know, so we have a later instance when everyone knows that there is a single bishop of Smyrna, and it says that the presbyters expelled this person from Smyrna.
Yeah.
So there you go. So we have we have counter evidence, in other words. The other thing to think about is that we have the writer Hegesippus that we've mentioned before, possibly a Jewish Christian, who had composed, 5 books of history of the church, and his memoirs. Well, Hegesippus, his dates, just so you know, are like from the year like 110 to 180, right around thereabouts. Well, in the mid 100s, in the mid 2nd century, he actually took it upon himself to travel from church to church, starting in Corinth. So he went from church to church to see what they were teaching at each church, and he actually writes. Eusebius records this later.
I have it here.
Oh, great! Yeah, read that.
I kind of figured you'd bring it up. So Hegesippus writes, and this is Eusebius recording from Hegesippus. Hegesippus writes, "The Corinthian church continued in the true doctrine until Primus became bishop. I mixed with them on my voyage to Rome and spent several days with the Corinthians, during which we were refreshed with the true doctrine. On arrival at Rome, I pieced together the succession down to Anicetus, whose deacon was Eleutherus, Anicetus being succeeded by Soter, and he by Eleutherus. In every line of bishops, and in every city, things accord with the preaching of the law, the prophets, and the Lord."
There you go. So by mid-2nd century, again, why do we bookend it with from Peter to Anicetus? There's a great example. So Hegesippus is clearly saying that, like, Anicetus, you know, like
right in his basically around the time that he visits Rome, he's very near the episcopate of Anicetus and begins drawing up a list from him, before him, and then right after him.
Yeah. Okay. So then to talk about what happens between Peter and Anicetus, why don't we just quickly trace out maybe, and this is very broad, guys. We're not going to be getting into like the details of every single like scholarly argument, but we know, generally speaking, you got about 4 major arguments or principles that these scholars will stick to say that there is no single bishop of Rome in the early 2nd century, and that there's just like, it's just a kind of a mess. You know, it's just a collection of different communities. Some of them are ethnic, and you have just a bunch of presbyteries in all these churches. So why don't we review that real quick?
Yeah.
So point number 1, they would assert that Rome as a city, as a church, is too diverse culturally and ethnically to have a single bishop, like practically speaking. So what would you say about that one, Danny?
So diverse not only in its population, that might have continued, but also just diverse in how many different house church units were in Rome. That's usually the argument, is that Rome is diverse ethnically, but also just there's pockets all throughout the city of different house churches that clearly had their own presbyters and leaders, and there's no way that you could gather all of that up and have this single figure. So what that is really doing, the problem with that assumption, really, is that they are assuming that nothing happened from when the Church of Rome was founded, when St. Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, all the way into the 2nd century. But unfortunately, there are things that happened in between those things, and that is, namely, the catastrophic event of the Roman persecution of Christians in the city of Rome. So nowhere else really in the empire was there a major killing, murdering of Christians by the tens, maybe even into the hundreds, except in the city of Rome. And that happened under Emperor Nero in 64. Okay. So scholars will say that, there's this diversity, there's a plethora of house churches in Rome, and there's got to be different, leadership structures and constitutions to all of this. And they base that on St. Paul's letter to the Romans, because in the last chapter of the letter to the Romans, written in the late 50s, okay, Paul is mentioning different people, listing out different people. And it seems that he's listing leaders of different house unit churches within the city of Rome. And so they carry that diversity and that non-unity into the 2nd century. But what we see happen in the 60s is this Neronian persecution, where we're told in the sources, Roman sources, by the way, that a great multitude of Christians are being killed by Emperor Nero in the city. So much so that he's able to crucify them, light them on fire, and then light up the streets of Rome at night. So we're talking at least dozens and dozens of Christians, most likely many of the leaders of the Roman Church.
Right.
So there's this kind of cataclysmic event that takes place in Rome. What do you think that does to the constitution of the church there? I would think, well, it would bind them together, wouldn't it? The ones that are left. We also surmise that this maybe was one of the reasons why Peter eventually came either back to Rome or to Rome for the first time, was to refound this church. So what scholars are really doing here is they're taking a pre-Neronian context and they're applying it to the 2nd century. But the church has already gone through this, not just that persecution, but also the persecution of Domitian in the 90s. So there's all these events that have been taken place that would have bound that church closer together, and it would have actually moved it further away from the synagogue.
Yeah. There's a peculiar tendency in scholarship to move at the pace of the sources. In one sense, it's admirable because they don't want to go beyond the sources, but in some cases, you also have to use your common sense and say, okay, just because we don't have Christian sources describing the situation, say, in Rome at this time, we do know historically, like, from the Roman perspective, what is going on. And so, like, you can usually see that, like, they just assume that because there's this silence of sources in a way from Peter to, say, a Clement or whatever, that, like, it just all stayed the same. But you're talking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30, like, a lot happens in just a year, let alone 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So a lot of things change. So they're, like you said, they're assuming this sort of pre-Neronian context of the Church of Rome, but that Nero event is cataclysmic for them. So it's very likely that the what do I want to say, the look of the Roman Church was different.
Well,
I can't think of the word I was trying to say.
And here's some small proof of that. We'll just mention it. By the time you mentioned Clement. By the time you come to Clement, the Bishop of Rome, we say the Bishop of Rome. Some will say just a presbyter or whatever. But when you come to his letter, he writes his letter. It titles it "The Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth."
Mm-hmm.
So somewhere between Paul's letter in the late 50s and Clement's letter in the 90s, the church had found unity.
Right.
Because it clearly is one church in Clement's time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that was one scholarly objection, is that Rome is too diverse to have a single bishop. The second one is that Ignatius, who, as we talked about in a couple episodes, was, almost hell-bent on the idea of there being a single bishop in every single church. Ignatius, peculiarly, when he writes to the Roman church, doesn't mention a single bishop, but he does do that with all of the other letters that he writes. So then that leads scholars to say, so that tells us that Rome, it confirms sort of their suspicions that Rome has this presbyteral model.
Yeah.
The third thing that scholars would say is the Shepherd of Hermes. So Shepherd of Hermes is this, we've mentioned before, but is an early 2nd century document, really split up into two parts. So we're talking about the early part of it, though, the early section of it. It alludes to a plurality of elders, right? In visions.
Yeah, we're talking really of the first four sections of that first part of the Shepherd. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's something that's bolstering their case.
And then the Shepherd of Hermes is written, well, I don't know if you mentioned, it's written around Rome, so it's a Roman document.
Oh, right, yeah.
Mentioning a plurality of, the elders who lead the church, the bishops who lead the church, the presbyters. It's using different terms for those who hold leadership in the Roman church.
Right. Hermes is a member of the Church of Rome. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then you have the fourth contention of scholars is that in the letter of Clement doesn't introduce himself as a bishop, whereas like people like Ignatius, he was never shy about calling himself a bishop. He calls himself, in fact, not the Bishop of Antioch, like we said, but the Bishop of Syria. So he's already assuming that because I'm the Bishop of Antioch, anything around Antioch is also under my jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. But Clement doesn't do that. He doesn't mention himself as the bishop. So scholars find that a little peculiar, and they use all four of these things to sort of build that case that there is no single bishop of Rome
in the early 2nd century. Yeah.
In the early 2nd century, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think, you already kind of listed our objections to the first one. I say we go through those last three real quick.
Wasn't that supposed to do that already?
What's that?
Wasn't that supposed to do that already?
That's all right. You were doing a good job. So we'll go through the last three. So let's start with Ignatius, right? Why don't you lead us off with that one? What about Ignatius? So why wouldn't Ignatius mention a single bishop of Rome, or what's our thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that Ignatius is writing to Rome, and it's very probable that he doesn't exactly know who the Roman bishop is. And so he just has to address the Church of Rome. Mm-hmm. The other thing to keep in mind is that the letter to the Romans is different than his other letters to the churches in Asia Minor. His letters to the churches in Asia Minor were about protecting against heresy. And so he's calling out their bishops, right? Saying, this is the man you must follow. Okay, he's orthodox, basically, is what he's telling these churches. And then he's sending, the bishops are coming to him, he's sending bishops back, delegates going back and forth. It's a different issue when he's writing to all those churches in Asia Minor. His purpose in writing to Rome is not to deflect or get rid of any heresy. It's literally to write to them on behalf of himself, to say, don't intercede to protect me from being martyred. because that's my destiny. I'm to be martyred. So the whole approach to the letter of the Romans is different. So we would expect the language to be different, in a sense. Is kind of the first thing I would say. The other thing, so the other thing I would say is that he may not know who the Bishop of Rome is because it's all the way in Rome at this early. You have to remember, and
that's not a short drive.
No, we'll always come back to this. We have to keep in mind numbers. In Ignatius's day, there's maybe only 10,000 Christians in the world. Okay, and so there's a lot of space in between communities.
Right.
Okay, there's a lot of geographic space in between communities. So he may not, in fact, know who at that particular time, there's no social media, who is ruling in Rome. Okay, so he just writes to the church in general, not yet knowing who the specific leader is. Another thing to look at is what Ignatius himself says about the church in general. So in Trallians, he has this interesting line in his letter to the Trallians. He says, "Similarly, let everyone respect the deacons as Jesus Christ, just as they should respect the bishop, who is a model of the Father, and the presbyters as God's council and as the band of the apostles. Without these," so deacons, a bishop, and the presbyters, "no group can be called a church."
Yeah, that's huge.
So that's Ignatius's idea of the church. Okay?
Yeah.
So what I would say is, how is it that this man who has that kind of idea of the church, in the same breath, write a letter to Rome saying, "Ignatius the image bearer, to the church that has found mercy in the majesty of the Father Most High and Jesus Christ his only Son. The church, beloved and enlightened through the will of the one who willed all things that exist, in accordance with faith in and love for Jesus Christ our God, which also presides in the place of the district of the Romans, worthy of honor, worthy of God, worthy of blessing, worthy of praise, worthy of success, worthy of sanctification, and presiding over love, observing the law of Christ, bearing the name of the Father, which I also greet in the name of Jesus Christ, Son of the Father." So you'd have to really argue here, because clearly Ignatius has his idea of what constitutes a church. It's a single bishop with a council of presbyters with deacons. And then he's writing to the Romans, referring to them as a proper church.
Right. So what's more likely, that Rome would not have a single bishop at the time, or that it would, and Ignatius just didn't know who it was and is writing to the Roman Church as he's on his way to be martyred there?
And that's a great point. And to that, not only that, Ignatius assumes, in my reading, Ignatius assumes that Rome has a single bishop, because he says this in his letter to Rome. He says, "Grant me nothing more than to be poured out as an offering to God while there is still an altar ready, so that in love you may form a chorus and sing to the Father in Jesus Christ, because God has judged the bishop from Syria worthy to be found in the west, having summoned him from the east." He's assuming Rome is going to form a chorus around its own bishop. Just
he mentions the Father, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just
his whole
as he
analogy.
is the bishop of Syria. He's using an analogy that he uses for Asia Minor, and he's kind of assuming that Rome has that same structure, that it would be familiar to them at least.
Right.
It would be embarrassing if he were to write to them these things, and that's not how Rome is constituted.
Yeah, if Ignatius had never said those words to the Trallians, that without these, bishop, presbyters, deacons, no gathering can be called a church. If he had never said that, you could argue that, oh, well, okay, at this time it's kind of loosey-goosey. Ignatius is kind of cool with, there being single bishops out here, but in Rome it's okay. They have just presbyters, but that's cool. But that's not the case. Like, if you're reading his letters, and then especially that note in Trallians, it's very clear that for him this is a non-negotiable. It's a non-negotiable for him. It's almost like a heresy to not have, your bishop with his presbyters gathered around him and his deacons. Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind, and this echoes a previous episode about Ignatius, but remember that who Ignatius is writing to and the kinds of communities he's writing to and which one he's writing from. Antioch is a Petrine church. So this shows, and the churches that he's writing to, right? Pontus, Galatia, Bithynia, Asia. These churches are Petrine churches. These are the areas that Peter himself references in 1 Peter, writing back and saying, "Oh, to those," assuming that these are his churches that he had established when he was making his way up to Rome. And he looks back to them. He says, "Greetings from Babylon," from Rome. These are Petrine churches, and all of them have this, according to our thesis on the Jerusalem Council episode, they have this Jerusalemite organization of a single figure, that everyone gathers around, that the presbyters are gathered around, who's presiding, exactly.
Who's preeminent.
Like when Peter leaves Jerusalem, immediately you have James of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. You have a single bishop of Jerusalem. And then he goes up to Antioch. He leaves Antioch. What do you got? A single bishop of Antioch. He keeps going. So then it's like, again, what is more likely? Like when Peter comes to Rome, he's just all of a sudden, it's going to be, oh yeah, just have a bunch of presbyters. So it's like we already know that Peter has a knack for leaving one single figure, which is very common to Judaism. I mean, if you're really thinking that your local community is getting together to offer offerings in a temple, which is what the book of Hebrews is telling us, which is which is what St. Paul is telling us, and all the early post-biblical Christian documents are telling us. Clement, the letter of Clement itself, is telling us that that's what they think they're doing when they get together. Well, then all the more that there would be a high priest, a Sanhedrin, and Levites. So, we have to. I'm just saying we just have to keep that in mind. That Ignatius himself is a Petrine man.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a good point.
Okay, the third thing, so Clement's letter, let's deal with that. So, they say, okay, Clement doesn't identify himself as this bishop of Rome, and as a commanding figure or something. But I would want to just say, let's just stop for a second here and ask ourselves, what do we really know reading the letter of Clement, and what do we not know? Mm-hmm. So scholars will say that, okay, he's writing to a church of Corinth, and he's only talking to presbyters out there. So there's this assumption that he's writing to a church that also has a presbyteral model of church leadership. And therefore, it lends credence to the fact that he himself has a presbyteral model, But again, look at the circumstances of the letter. Sometimes we can forget that what's staring us in the face. Clement is writing a letter representing the Church of Rome to a foreign church, and he's rebuking them for disposing some of their presbyters, and he's telling them, restore those former presbyters. Mm-hmm. It's like one of those things where it's staring you in the face, but you're not willing to admit it, or you're not willing to acknowledge it.
At least what you're seeing is the authority of the Roman Church, because again, Corinth is a prominent early Christian church with a starred history. Okay, mm-hmm. Obviously 2 New Testament letters were directed to them from St. Paul. St. Paul spent time there, and there's plenty of other churches near Corinth that Corinth could have sought out to say, hey, help us settle our dispute.
Exactly.
But that didn't happen. For some reason, Corinth asked for Rome to settle the dispute.
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost as if when scholars go to read the memoirs of Clement, the veil of Calvin is over their faces. It's like you're not seeing it because you don't want to see it, mm-hmm. But it's right there looking at you in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, the other thing then is the Shepherd of Hermes. So they mention, he mentions a collection of presbyters, and he's writing from Rome. So what can we kind of say about that, right? Because I'm pretty sure Clement is mentioned in the letter.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, a couple things. I don't know. Do you have the quote? But yeah. So in the Shepherd. of Hermes,
I have the quote actually. Yeah. For
in the beginning of the Shepherd of Hermes, again, an early 2nd century document. He's the one who tells us that it was Clement's job to represent the Church of Rome.
Yeah, so here's the quote. So he says, Therefore, you will write 2 little books. You will send one to Clement and one to Grafty. Grafty's a woman, by the way. Then Clement will send it to the cities abroad, because that is his job. But Grafty will instruct the widows and the orphans. But you yourself will read it to this city, along with the elders who preside over the church. Okay.
And you yourself, as in Hermes,
Yeah.
will read it
saying,
with the presbyters
you,
to
Hermes,
the people.
a prophet, will read it among the presbyters to the churches of this city. It's like, but then what you're going to do is write it, give it to Clement, because it's only his job to correspond with foreign churches in other cities.
Basically, to represent the Church of Rome.
To speak for the Church of Rome.
Yeah.
So you have a figure named Clement, who is likely the very Clement that Paul mentions in his letter to the Philippians, who is a companion of Paul. And he's being singled out as the only person who is allowed to write to churches outside of Rome, speaking on behalf of the Roman Church. Mm-hmm. And then he says, you as a prophet now, you're going to take this book and you're going to go read it to the churches of this city with all the elders who preside in it.
Right. So you can either read that and say, okay, Clement's just kind of a messenger, or you can side on the side of tradition and say, that sounds a lot like a council of presbyters with Clement being representative of those council of presbyters for the Church of Rome to the other churches.
Exactly.
That sounds a lot like a leading figure among the presbyter bishop.
It really depends on where you put the emphasis on the syllable too, because it's like when you look at that sentence, you have you will send one to Clement, one to Grafty. He says, then Clement will send it to the cities abroad because that is his job. Now, the scholars will read it as because that is his job. But what we're saying is, no, that is his job, not yours. Mm-hmm. And remember, Hermes is a prophet. Why wouldn't he be able to send his prophecy abroad?
And it's not like Clement is an ambassador, because he's not traveling with the letters. No, he's penning it. Exactly. He's charged with. Obviously, they trust him. He's charged with writing correspondence and then sending it out in the name of the Church of Rome.
Yeah.
So again, is that proving the Roman papacy? Well, no. But is it proving the Presbyterian model or plurality of government? Well, not really either.
Right.
So it's almost an argument in silence from maybe even both sides. But again, what we would say is that but we have tradition on our side, and tradition is telling us late in the 2nd century that Clement indeed was the preeminent figure in the Roman Church.
Yeah. And you had mentioned to me before, I remember we were talking about this before, offline, as they say, and you were talking about the second half of the Book of Hermes, when you are in, kind of approaching the mid-2nd century. And there is this kind of peculiar reference to a man seated on a chair with presbyters on a bench.
Yeah, we're not going to make too much of it, but to say that there is no evidence in the Shepherd of Hermes of the kind of model constitution of the church that we're talking about, a bishop with a council of presbyters, may not actually be factual. So if you look in the section of the Shepherd of Hermes called the mandates or the commandments, these are commandments that are given to him in a vision from an angel. And it is what it is what it says. They're commandments, right? But commandment 11 in this vision says, the angel, showed me people seated on a bench and another person seated on a chair. In the Greek, cathedron or cathedra, seated on a chair. So you have a bench of people, then you have a chair, someone seated on that. And then it goes into talk about how that person seated on the chair is a false prophet. And then the commandment is about how to discern between a false prophet on the chair and a true prophet on the chair. It doesn't talk about how the chair shouldn't be there at all. It just talks about how to discern whether who is in the chair is a true prophet or a false prophet. But what I find interesting is that a little later on, he says this of the person who sits on the chair who's a true prophet. He says, the person who sits on the chair, does he speak on his own? but when God wants him to speak. So then when the person who has the divine spirit comes into an assembly of righteous people who have faith in the divine spirit, and intercession is made to God by the assembly of those people, then the angel of the prophetic spirit that is assigned to him fills the person. And being filled with the Holy Spirit, the man speaks to the multitude just as the Lord wills. In this way, then, the divine spirit will be obvious. Such, therefore, is the power of the discernment with respect to the divine spirit of the Lord. So in other words, what he's saying is the true prophet doesn't speak on his own accord, but he speaks on behalf of the whole people of God by the Spirit of God. Now, that's what a Roman Catholic would say about the Pope as well.
Right.
The Pope doesn't get to speak on his own. He doesn't get to give his own opinions and they be authoritative. He speaks the tradition. That's the role of the Pope. So you almost have a little bit of that in there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting tidbit. I mean, even if he's not talking about, say, what's currently going on with the current chair of Peter, for instance, you don't know if when he mentions that cathedra, if he's talking about the specific cathedra of Peter that Peter taught from as a Jew sitting down to teach among the churches. But even if he's talking about just like a parallel group, that'll eventually arise, right? The point is, like you said, he's not objecting to that structure. When he would say anyone who sets himself up as some leader with a council of presbyters on the bench around him. I mean, my goodness, no, we rule like equally as presbyters or something. He doesn't say that though. He objects on a different ground as a spiritual level, not on the organizational level.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. So that would be our retorts to the main contentions or the main quote-unquote bits of evidence that scholars hang their hats on to object to a monoepiscopal organization of the Roman Church in the early 2nd century. Okay. Now I think it's on us to sort of give our hypothesis then, so like what did happen, between Peter and Anicetus. Well, like you said, either argument is an argument from silence. So the question is, like, whose argument from silence is just a little louder in a way, But, just from the outset, I would say, why is it, I think this is so strange to me, but why is it that the assumption among scholars is that they associate single bishop, development, presbyteral model, primitive? Why that association? Especially when all over the book of Acts, we don't have a presbyteral model in the Church of Jerusalem. We don't see that, We already see this premier figure of James, and you'll see even scholars in the same breath talk about, presbyteral model, it's more primitive, But then they'll also emphasize that James is this premier figure in the Church of Jerusalem.
Well, in spite of Peter, in spite of Peter, just to get those Catholics, those pesky Catholics, papists.
Yeah. So all you can see then in the assumptions is a bias against Roman claims. That's really what is motivating it, and it's a carryover from earlier Protestant contentions about the source material. And we identified this when we were in academia, we identified this pretty early, where we were like, why do they, why are they doing that necessarily? And everybody just keeps saying it, but is that really what the sources are showing us? They might also associate presbyteral with primitive because of what they see on the pages of St. Paul. Because I would say it is fairly clear. I mean, not totally clear. I would still have some objections, but it is fairly clear that, Paul has a presbyteral model in mind.
Well, we even surmised that in our episodes during the first century that Paul's idea of the constitution of the church perhaps was a little different than, say, St. Peter or St. James. And that's okay, because again, this is chapter 1 of the church's story. Yeah,
and plus, where's Paul? Paul's from Troas, right? Or I'm sorry,
no,
that's where he left his coat. Tarsus. Paul's from Tarsus.
Yeah.
It's a T word. So Paul's from Tarsus. Okay,
yeah.
He's not from Jerusalem. Peter was in Jerusalem. Peter's with Christ, right? So Peter's perspective on how the church is supposed to be organized here in this Jerusalem community is going to be a little different than how Paul is organizing communities out somewhere else.
Well, and also because frankly, Paul was not part of the 12.
Right. Yeah. And Paul's growing up experience of Judaism is the synagogue. Mm-hmm. He is synagogal. That's why he's also able to quote philosophers and stuff, because he's very Hellenistic.
He tells us he didn't study under the Sadducees, he studied under the Pharisees.
Exactly. So he has this kind of Hellenistic flavor to him in a way, in his thought. And it's all over the pages of his writings. Sure. So, yeah, he's going to be much more of a synagogal model, which, had a lot of, just a bunch of elders. But when you're talking about, Peter's daily experience of Judaism, it's very much surrounded by the temple. So that's why Peter is more apt to take a position of a high priest with a Sanhedrin.
Yeah, and not just his daily dose of Judaism, but his daily dose of Christianity in the early centuries, which we've traced, going up to the temple every day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So again, I would question just from the outset, before the bull even runs out of the gates, we'd say, well, why are you assuming monepiscopacy, development, presbyteral, primitive? Yeah. I think we can throw that out.
You can at least question that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go through our kind of hypothesis. So I think there's a question that at this point maybe Orthodox would bring up, right? Because the common objection is well, why Rome and not Antioch? Because it's clear that Peter was not just in Rome and didn't just consecrate people in Rome, or ordain people there. He ordained people all over the place when he was establishing churches, right? Yeah.
So what's so special about a successor of Rome is basically?
Yeah. I mean, this would be my answer to that, at least. I would say it's the subtle difference, but important difference between, let's say, St. Paul talking to Timothy, kindle afresh the gift that was given to you through the laying on of my hands, and in the book of Acts, chapter 2, let another take his office.
So when Judas is no longer an apostle because he's committed suicide, the apostles get together and they say we need another person to literally take his office, and Matthias is then named as the 12th, the replacement to Judas.
Exactly. There's a difference between ordaining an episkopos in Smyrna as you're on your way to the next city,
or consecrating one.
Yeah. There's a difference between that and going to Rome in the final stages of your life. You're going to die. Jesus told you were going to. And you say, I'm appointing a successor for my ministry. My personal charism and ministry that was given to me by Christ, I'm giving it to another man to keep guard over it.
So your answer is why Rome and not Antioch? It's because, well, Peter didn't end his ministry in Antioch. And so He didn't see a need to hand over his office to anyone in Antioch.
Yeah. He may have appointed a bishop in Antioch, but he didn't appoint a successor there.
Right.
Yeah. See, because Rome is not Peter's missionary territory. Wherever Peter was going before that was missionary territory. He's bringing the gospel as a herald of the gospel. When he comes to Rome, there's already a church there. Mm-hmm. So this isn't missionary ground. Peter's there as a pastor. He's there acting as what later Christians would say, he's the first bishop of Rome, truly, because he's not only overseeing the church there at the time, but he's also the premier apostle.
And remember what we said. We said it's very possible that he's actually reconstituting the church in Rome. Mm-hmm. Because it may have been Nero's persecution that was the impetus for him to go back to Rome if he had been there before. Now he's going back to reestablish the church there because of how much it's been decimated by the persecution.
Yeah. So let's put ourselves in Peter's shoes too, right? He receives this commission from Jesus that you're the rock. You're the rock, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church. Great gates of hell aren't going to prevail against it. After the resurrection, Jesus says, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. So that's Peter's specific commission. In the book of Acts, it's clear, if we had any doubt about what Matthew 16 meant or what John 21 meant, we see what it means in the book of Acts. It's mm-hmm. clearly Peter who is this leader of the Jerusalem community, and there's no question about his authority there. Mm-hmm. So Peter takes his Jerusalemite model to Rome, like we said, but on top of that, let's remember, this is in the 60s. What is going on in Jerusalem? right?
A whole heck of a lot. Yeah, we had the persecution that led to the death of Saint James, the Lord's brother. So the bishop of Jerusalem, when Peter was not there, who presided over Jerusalem, is killed by the Jewish authorities there. In the sources, or Christian sources, they had always believed that the death of James and the coming invasion of the Romans was God's punishment on the Jews for condemning James, for killing James. So we know that those events happened pretty closely in time. But the Romans are preparing to invade Palestine, and they do in the year 66. So James probably dies in 62. The invasion's coming in 66. But between 62 and 66, there's uprisings. There's all kinds of things going on in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Not just the death of their leader, but you can imagine Christians starting to leave the city and flee the city.
Yeah, and I mean the persecution in Jerusalem is from the Jews. I mean, from the Jewish leadership. I mean, they're killing like people in the church, including James. So the Jerusalem church, by and large, is kind of in shambles at this point. But apart from that, it's also looking like an ethnic church. You know, Christianity has changed already. I mean, from the time that St. Paul's running around in the 40s and 50s to the Jerusalem Council to, now when you get out of Jerusalem and you get out of that sort of ethnic center of Jewish Christianity in Jerusalem and you get out to the quote unquote diaspora in these other cities, there's Hellenistic Jews, Greeks, like God-fearers, like people who become Christians.
Syrians.
It's this very different landscape, and it's the majority landscape, So here's Peter in Rome. Like, that's the reason why he's not going to be looking back to Jerusalem, right? As like that, but listen to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's a very peculiar type of church now. It's a very ethnic church. And like we said, it's a church that's in crisis. So here's Peter now realizing that the original center of Christianity or of this new movement is not as strong as it was back in the day. And then here he is, the leader of the apostles. And imagine being the Jerusalem church. James is gone, and so then you have like these leaders of the Jerusalem church who are leading it. And Peter, the premier apostle, is off in another city. You're not going to assert your authority. You don't have any. I mean, at that point, like it's gone. Like everything that you had before is kind of gone. Peter knows that when he's in Rome, So I think it's just only practical.
You were practical, right? So you were saying that put yourself in Peter's shoes.
Yeah.
Peter has Jesus telling him personally that I'm going to build my church upon you. You're going to have the keys. You're going to be able to loose and to bind, okay? He says that to other apostles, but he gives it first to Peter. So Peter knows he has a special commission. His office is a little different than the rest of the apostles.
Yes.
And so now he's coming to Rome, where he knows he's probably going to die. It's the end of his life because of the Neronian persecution. It's a hotbed for persecuting Christians in Rome. The tensions between Romans and Jews, all of that is happening in the 60s when he's in Rome. And so he probably knows, perhaps even receives a vision from Christ about his coming death. And here he is thinking, well, if my office goes away, it can't. It can't go away because another must take this office. Just as Matthias took Judas's office. Someone needs to take my personal office. And it happens to be that I'm in Rome. And so before I die, I must do something about that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Entering into the practical psychology of Peter, not that we know everything he's thinking, but just knowing what we know of him, like this naturally would have been weighing on him. So there's this other interesting thing that we have to consider, and it's that Peter might have established in Rome a Jerusalemite tetrarchy, we can call it. And meaning that just like in Jerusalem, where you have what Paul says, these men were reputed to be pillars. We can call it like the pillar model. You have Peter, James, and John. And you have that all throughout the Gospels. It's not just in Paul's letter. Paul confirms it, but you have it all throughout Paul's letter.
But
through the Gospels, as Peter, James, and John who are singled out by Christ.
But we know that it continued, though. In Paul's letters, he's not talking about the same tetrarchy.
Right.
In the Gospels, he's talking about Peter, James, and John, James
Right.
and John being the sons of Zebedee.
Mm-hmm.
But then we know that model of setting up three pillars continued after James Zebedee dies, because then James, the Lord's brother, takes James's place.
Right.
And we know that from Paul's letters. Paul says, they're reputed to be the pillars, Peter, James, and John.
Right. Yeah. So when we come to Rome, we have a whisper. It's not a shout, but we have a whisper of this Roman tetrarchy. And it's in the source, the Liber Pontificalis. So the Liber Pontificalis is basically a succession list of the bishops of Rome. And it has many stages in which it is written. That even like towards it's going all the way into the Middle Ages. Yeah, it's continued and perpetuated.
It seems like the compiler started in the 6th century and then went all the way to the 8th and 9th centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the most gracious dates, the earliest that people have mentioned is like the 4th and 5th centuries. But yeah, I think it's safe to say 6th century would be like the earliest. But what you have going on there, so I'll read this section on Peter and listen to what he says. He, by direction, he's talking about Clement, okay? So he says, Clement composed 2 epistles, which are called Catholic. So remember that Clement's letters are even considered universal by the church by the early church. It says, he, by the direction of Blessed Peter, undertook the pontifical office of governing the church, even as Peter received the seat of authority from the Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, Linus and Cletus are recorded before him for the reason that they were ordained bishops also by the chief of the apostles, but to perform the priestly ministry. So typically our succession lists with Peter, right? They go Peter, Linus, Cletus, then Clement. Mm-hmm. In this case, even in the Liber Pontificalis, the Liber Pontificalis does list it that way. Peter, Linus, Cletus, Clement. However, when you come to the actual notes on Clement, it says, but Clement was designated as governor of the church because Peter had received that authority from the Lord Jesus Christ. Then Peter consecrated 2 other bishops, Linus and Cletus, but specifically to perform what he calls in his time the priestly ministry, which we in Peter's actual time would be like to oversee the gathering of the Christians, like to oversee the table, right? Altar and sacrifice, as Saint Cyprian would eventually say.
Yeah. So what you have there is an admission by one of what used to be one of the official lists of Rome, of the Vatican, the Liber Pontificalis, in saying that there was a plurality of bishops in the early Roman Church, but with one preeminent figure in Clement.
Right.
Now, you might get scholars who say, well, this is kind of anachronistic, this text, which it is in many instances. It gets a lot wrong, okay? Mm-hmm. And what they might want to say is that, well, the idea of Peter appointing suffragan bishops is a later thing that they're kind of writing into it. But maybe it's not. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is holding on to an early truth that Peter did actually consecrate 3 bishops in Rome, mm-hmm. with only one of them having his specific office. Right.
So he's replicating the Peter, James, John of Jerusalem in Rome as Clement, Linus, Cletus. Yes. Clement, Linus, Cletus.
Yeah.
So you have
that's
Clement,
possible.
Yeah, you have Clement as governor, and you have Linus and Cletus as sort of overseeing the table fellowship of these disparate communities in Rome.
Sure.
Now, I mean, is there anything else that maybe might lend credence to that? I mean, like, because we also have, isn't even like the number of bishops of Rome like, doesn't it kind of get like where you have like six
Well,
of them?
It is interesting. So if you were to say that that's true, that that Peter did establish the old tetrarchy like they did in Jerusalem with Linus, Cletus, and Clement, there's after those guys, there's a nice even number of 6 more bishops,
Right.
before you get to Anicetus.
Anicetus, yeah.
So you have another 3. In other words, you have a set of 3 and another set of 3 that could be there. That's what it is. Take it for what it is. But maybe the Liber Pontificalis is hinting at this ancient tradition, unknowingly, that a tetrarch was again set up in Rome.
Well, the other thing that would lend credence to it, if we were to like kind of run with that, is maybe that's the reason why someone like Ignatius doesn't really know who he's writing to.
Right.
Because he does know that there are multiple bishops, but maybe he doesn't know which one of them would be considered sort of the governing overseer of the Church of Rome. Yeah. But he does know that there's quite a few bishops there, so that's a possibility that might explain the Ignatius phenomenon.
Sure.
One thing that we would say, so I think we are going to hang our hat, though, because of the evidence aforementioned that about Clement. We are going to assert that Clement is actually that direct successor of St. Peter.
Well, and here's what we'll say. Look, texts like the Liber Pontificalis, there's a lot of legend in there. They get the dates all wrong. And it's not just the Liber Pontificalis, by the way, that we have succession lists. There's a document called the Chronograph of 354, which we've talked about on this channel before when we were talking about the date for Christmas. In that chronograph, it also has a succession list, and it too gets some dates wrong. And sometimes the early names are switched, like one comes first when it should really come third or fourth or something like that. What is important is not the biographies. What's important are not the dates. What was important to the early church was the names.
Yeah.
The names were important.
And they're consistent.
And anytime you look at any list, whether it's the list that Hegesippus was compiling, or the list you find in the Chronograph of 354, or the list that finally ends up in the Book of Pontiffs, Liber Pontificalis, or
Irenaeus.
Saint Irenaeus himself,
Right.
writing in the late 2nd century. I'm gonna read that section. It's too beautiful not to read. But even Saint Irenaeus himself, all those lists have the same names. The names of the succession lists stuck in the living memory of the church. They may not have known exactly what dates they lived or when they ruled, but they remembered the preeminent men. And it's to me it's wholly ridiculous to think that the church in Saint Irenaeus or Hegesippus would be publicly proclaiming these names as the successors of Peter against the Gnostics in a time when the Gnostics could have easily discredited it.
Because they're in Rome.
Valentinus is in Rome. Marcion is in Rome.
Marcion's in Rome.
They would know. They could easily discredit it. But yet you have these late 2nd century saints asserting these lists of names. And that's what was important to him. Irenaeus doesn't list biographies. He lists the names. Here's the names of the preeminent men since Peter. That's what was important to them in the late 2nd century.
And the dating of the list. Rome's list is among the earliest.
No, it is the earliest. So whether Antioch has claims, Corinth has claims, succession lists, Jerusalem has succession lists, Alexandria has succession lists. The fact remains that the earliest evidence for any list, for any bishops going back to the apostles, the earliest evidence for that comes from the succession lists of Rome in the late 2nd century.
Yeah. Yeah.
No other city has evidence of an earlier list.
In Eusebius's description of Hegesippus's journey to Rome, it's clear that he doesn't gather succession lists from the other churches that he's traveling to.
Yeah.
He just gets the one from Rome.
Yeah. I mean, again, look, scholars can be scholars, and Catholics have their biases and Protestants have their biases. But at the end of the day, on this channel, we also like to be very practical.
Right.
And think about in our own country, right? Think about somebody who in the 1870s was going to compile a succession list of presidents. And for the first 7 of them, they just made up some names and threw them in there. Do you think that would stand? No, because there's people still living in the very day of the compilation that would have known people in the previous generations.
You actually have people, it's even more than that. You have people who are claiming a rival presidency of the United States, in that context. Like have like, we'll talk about, we're sort of jumping the gun on Marcion, but Marcion actually does for the first time have a parallel hierarchy even that he's establishing in Rome, contra the Roman bishop. So all the more, if he was really going to undercut these claims, he could have done it like easily.
Yeah. And not just, there's a living voice still there. We're only talking about 50 years.
Yeah.
At the most.
Yeah.
Where there's some gaps. But there's also just all the sources we no longer have available to us.
Right.
But back then they had all the sources available to them.
Yeah. It's almost like, when St. Paul says we could have written a letter to you. Like he's like, you are our letter, Polycarp is the Roman Church's letter in a way, because it's like Polycarp goes back to the Apostle John. He goes to Rome to meet Anicetus, which means that that's not the first time, that there's a single bishop of Rome. Like stretching back in his lifetime, you know what I mean? Like he's an apostolic man, Right. So it's like at the very least, if he already is traveling across the empire to go meet a single bishop of Rome, there had to have at least been a single bishop of Rome the last like 1 or 2 before Anicetus, and that's already putting us into that age of the apostolic writings.
Yeah.
The so you're like so once again, like, why is it that scholars, even though the succession lists of other churches date to a later time than that of Rome's, why is it they're so willing to give those succession lists the benefit of the doubt for those other churches, but not for Rome? Mm-hmm. Again, it just shows the bias,
Well, there's no bias with St. Irenaeus, so let me read this section.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is from St. Irenaeus against heresies, late 2nd century, 180s. He writes in the 3rd book, "Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles, of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome, by the 2 most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time, by means of the successions of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church, on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolical tradition has been preserved continuously by those faithful men who exist everywhere. The blessed apostles, then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him in the 3rd place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. Mm-hmm. This man, as he had seen the blessed apostles, and had been conversant with them, might be said to have the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears, and their traditions before his eyes."
Right.
So even in Irenaeus, his list is matching up with other lists that we know of.
Mm-hmm.
Even in Irenaeus, he is getting the names right.
Mm-hmm.
So the Liber Pontificalis is saying, well, Linus and Cletus were 2 bishops, and then Clement was preeminent. He's saying, no, Linus was the bishop that Peter appointed to carry on his specific office. That doesn't matter. The names matter. We have the names of the preeminent men who led the church in Rome down to St. Peter himself.
Yeah, and again, if our thesis is correct, so let's say like Irenaeus is actually mistaken, I guess, on this, where Linus is the successor, and if we were to go with the thesis that Peter does make Clement his personal successor with like these two assisting, based on a tetrarchy that's in Jerusalem. Like if we were to hypothesize that, it would actually make a lot of sense too, either way, whether it's Clement or Linus, because both men are Pauline men. Mm-hmm. Like these are both companions of the Apostle Paul and are associated with St. Paul.
Yeah.
So it's very wise in a way that Peter would choose a Pauline man to be his personal successor, once again cementing, whether Paul's alive at this time or already dead, already martyred. Yeah, Peter is choosing a Pauline man as his personal successor, which further cements the idea for the churches that the Church of Jew and the Church of Gentile are one. Mm-hmm. And that's why we get these later, acclamations that like that the Church of Rome is the Church of Unity. Mm-hmm. I think that's good, but I think if we were just kind of step back for a second and imagine like maybe our Protestant listeners like listening up to this point. I mean, personally, I know that if I were still a Protestant, I would listen to this and say, so what? Like who cares? Like what is the, show me in the Bible kind of a thing, In fact, I recently watched an episode of Capturing Christianity where Cameron Bertuzzi was interviewing Scott Hahn, and Cameron basically just, the typical Protestant thing is like, just show me the papacy. Show me the papacy. And Scott Hahn brilliantly, of course, went through like his theological argument from the Old Testament and into the New Testament. But personally, if I was talking to Cameron Bertuzzi or someone like him, I wouldn't even go there yet. Like I would step back and I would say, first, Cameron, like what kind of evidence would satisfy you? Really? Like what is it that I would have to show you in the Bible for you to be convinced of the Roman papacy? And the reason I say that is because there's a whole substructure to the papacy that the Orthodox and Catholics have in common with each other that Protestants do not. So it's almost like if the biblical evidence I will show you will not satisfy you, then what is the point of even me answering the question for you? Because there's so many things that you haven't accepted yet that would lead you to the papacy. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't even, to be honest with you, if a Protestant asked me to show them the papacy, my answer to them is, I'm not going to show you the papacy, but I will invite you to sit with me as I talk to an Orthodox to prove the papacy to them. Because the only viable alternative to Catholicism, in my mind, is orthodoxy. The Orthodox have preserved an apostolic form of Christianity that it has existed apart from the papacy, that accepts the sacraments, that accepts apostolic succession, monepiscopacy, the idea of a primacy. Those are things that we hold in common with the Orthodox, and we are the historic communities that go back to the apostles. So when you have a Protestant asking you, like, prove the papacy, you're like, well, there's a ton of other things you got to accept first before I even talk about the papacy. Yeah. So that would be like my first thing with him. But if I was pressed against the wall, reviewing back what we've talked about, this is why this episode is kind of like the consummation of what we talked about in the Jerusalem Council episode, the Jerusalem Council So What episode, the fall of Jerusalem and James. All of those episodes that we were doing is kind of leading up to this point in a way. Because if you look at the Bible, okay, we look at the New Testament, like you said to begin with, Dan, like all we have to do from the Catholic point of view is not point out chapter 24 of the Church's story with Vatican I. What we need to look for is the foundation for Vatican I there? Are the seeds of that doctrine there? Mm-hmm. And again, you and I would point them to the book of Acts, chapter 15. Go to the Jerusalem Council and look at the pattern that arises of decision-making. So I would say there's a six-fold pattern of decision-making that happens. Number one, you have a doctrinal question arise. That's Acts chapter 15, verse 1. You then have a controversy that ensues, a division among the churches. That's Acts chapter 15, verses 2 through 5. The third thing, you have the apostolic council is called. Apostles come together in Jerusalem, and an open debate takes place.
Not just the apostles, but all the presbyters are there too.
Yes.
And some of the priests who converted.
Exactly.
Yep.
That's Acts chapter 15, verses 6 through 7a. Then the fourth thing, you have Peter's decision. You have a Petrine authoritative decision at the council. That's Acts chapter 15, 7b through 12, where it says that all fell silent after Peter spoke. Number 5, then you have the canons that are drafted. That's James. We said James is not the leader of the Jerusalem Council. James is what we would later call the canonist of the council. He's the one who writes out the canons, the supplemental decisions of this council.
And as bishop comes up with the rules of implementation of the decision.
That's number 6, right? So Acts chapter 15, verse 19 is the canons, but then the implementation is the final phase of a council, and that's Acts chapter 15, verses 22 through 35. So right there, doctrinal question, controversy, council, Peter's decision, canons are drafted, and then implementation. Those 6 elements of authoritative church decision-making. Only one church has done that for 2,000 years to the present day. And it's not Protestantism, of course, but it's also not Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy has not been able, generally speaking, to gather a council since 787.
The conciliar church.
Right. Despite its claim to being the conciliar church. Well, the irony is that the conciliar church can't gather a council. I'm not here to dig at them and make fun of them. I'm speaking factually about this. They've not been able to do it, And that's the irony of conciliarism as an ecclesiology, is that you can't have an authoritative council without a recognized primate to gather it. Which is why, all the more ironically, conciliarism is condemned as a heresy at the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512 to 17. So Rome has actually been able to continue to take up new questions that have created division amongst the churches. They've been able to call a council. They've permitted open debate. They've settled the matter with Petrine authority. They draft canons, and then they implement the decisions throughout the world. And Rome has been able to accomplish that 14 times since the East-West Schism. Mm-hmm. Yep. So reading the book of Acts, it certainly does give you the impression that this is still kind of like a natural and nascent way of dealing with, decision-making in the church. But the fact of the matter is, this is what the apostles gave us as the way to make decisions. It seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us, right? Mm-hmm. But then you even have, later on we'll talk about the Council of Chalcedon, you have this acclamation. Once Pope Leo sends his tome to the East, they read it at Chalcedon, and then all the bishops in acclamation were said to have exclaimed, "Peter has spoken through Leo." Now, regardless of what the East-West interpretation of that acclamation has been through up and down the ages, the point is that they're actually referencing the Jerusalem Council. When Peter stood up.
When everybody else fell silent and Peter stood up and said something.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're saying Leo, or Peter has spoken through Leo at this council, just as Peter spoke to the apostles at the Council of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So if there was ever a kernel of the Roman Church's later dogma, that we can find in the Bible. And this is apart from just Matthew 16, what we know of Matthew 16, John 21. That's in the background of all this. But if there's ever a kernel or a seed of the church's later fully blossomed dogma of the papacy, it's this whole scene in Acts provides everything that you need to demonstrate it. Yeah. And then the subsequent history only confirms it.
Right. And that's the office of Peter that we're saying needed to be replaced.
Exactly.
Somebody needed to take that spot, and Peter gave that spot up to someone in Rome.
Let another take his office.